The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, right. Good afternoon and good morning, wherever in the world you may be. I'm sitting in my basement, of course, thanks to this little virus problem we're all currently going through. Yeah, my name's Dave. My colleague Thomas is a panelist. I'm sure he's going to pop in now and say hello.
Hello.
Hey, Thomas. Thanks
Hi, Dave.
for joining me. Hey, welcome. Today we're going to talk about the particle system, and we're going to talk about light layers. So the particle system allows us to generate particles, oddly enough, and the light layers allow us to manipulate and to use light inside of Pandora's box. If you have any questions, please jump in and ask questions. We'll do our best to answer them. Yeah, thanks for joining. Okay, so there we go. Right, we're going to do an overview of the particle system and setting them up, a little couple of tips and tricks, and just some ideas on how you can best use them in your projects. You know, kind of just giving you some pointers in helping you getting more creative with our product and helping you get the most out of what you can do with it. So let's dive in. Let's get going. Okay. So the Pandora's Box particle system, basically it generates content. It is live in a 3D environment. So every little particle that you generate or is generated will continue to be tracked throughout that or throughout our 3D engine until its end of life comes up. You can also add 3D objects to it, and you can kind of do some cool things to the particles. And then again, using that, you can add some tracking to it, or you can use it for tracking situations. So I've got a tiny little demo built into this as well for you. Yeah, so let's have a look. Our particle system is called the Firefly particles, and you can use it on a player or you can use it on a server, and you can also add it. So you can add it in two ways. So I'm going to change over now to my Pandora's Box project. Okay, so here's my little project. I have a server that I've added into my show, and I've got a particle system. So if you want to add a particle system, you can do that by right-clicking on your client. In this case, I've got a dual server, and you can go to add device. So in your add device, obviously you can add video layers or graphic layers or audio layers, and you can add a particle system layer, and you can also add a light layer, which we will get to. So you could add a particle system layer, which I've done, and you can also do it by just adding the particle system onto an existing layer. So you can go to your emitters and your systems, right? So what is an emitter? An emitter is I don't want to use the word thing, but we'll use the word thing. So the emitter is the thing that sends out the particles. The particle system is essentially the part of the engine that handles where all of these little bits of particles go inside of the 3D environment or the 2D environment if you have a player license. Okay, so right, let's have a look at our particle system layer. So I have in my project, okay, here's my project, here's my particle system layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my first queue, and pardon me, there is my particle system, right? I've set it up. This is my layer set up. Let's just go quickly through the through the device using our device viewer. We're going to look at it, give you an overview of what's kind of happening, what each section of it does, and then we'll do some more creative things. Okay, right, so it's broken up obviously, so you can obviously set your opacity. You can then define your X and Y position of your particle system inside of your 3D environment. You can then also apply things like gravity. So now my particles are falling down. You can add wind, you can blow your particles around, etc., etc. Then in my particle emitter, I have I've added a piece of media, so I have a 2x2 white pixel, and you can also add a mesh. So you can take your particles and apply them to objects or to X files or to little meshes, and you can then manipulate these meshes inside of your 3D environment. Then my next section is the emitter type. So the emitter is what it's the source of those particles, where it's coming from. So I have it set up here to be a point, and if I look at it with my global camera, you can then see there's a point where I'm generating my particles from. I'm not sure how well that's coming up going through the GoToWebinar screen. So there is my point, generating my or emitting my particles. My apologies. Then I can also change it to a line type. I can also change it to a circle. 1 second. Okay. I can also change it to a sphere. Okay, there we go. So now my particles are all coming out in a sphere, just being randomly generated from that center point. I can also, okay, so if I go in a bit closer, I can also change, so you can also, basically the emitter just defines how those particles come out and where they come out from. You can also define how those particles fly. So if I look at my particle alignment, billboarding means that those particles are always pointing to my camera or to my global camera. If I change that to flight direction, now you can see that my particles are traveling off in the, the objects are now facing that direction that they've been sent out on, and they will continue on in that path until they reach their end of life. Again, if we move a bit further on, we can then change the radius, or we can change the length. So now I can spread my particles out over a larger area. And I can also change the angle. So I can also fiddle around with that and really start changing out how my particles are generated in my environment. Again, there's X values and X position, X angles. You can also change rotation pivots, so you can really start manipulating how and where these particles come into existence inside of your 3D world. So I'm just going to reset some of these things back down again. Okay, so if I've set it to none, obviously I'll have no emitting. While we're talking about that, that's a good point. So if I go back to my line, actually just go to point, my particles are coming out from a single point. I can also change my radius and my angle, so that will start changing. It's really just how wide the particles are going to spread out from that point. Then what is an important thing to note, and if I manipulate my camera so you can actually see where my particles are going, I have the count per second and the time to live. those are two very important aspects to remember when dealing with a particle system, because if you have too many counts or too many particles being released per second, then you may run into some performance problems, because each of those particles that are being emitted will stay alive in your render engine, and they'll be consuming system performance to generate these particular particles. So if you have a really high count of particles and they're living for a really long time, you can definitely start to see some performance issues arising. Obviously, it depends on your individual system performance, just how many particles you can generate, and if you have 3D models, objects or meshes for each particle, obviously that is also going to hamper that performance. Then if you do have a situation where you start to see, I don't really want to push the performance too much because this is a live demo and it would be really not so funny if I was to have a performance issue. But if you do find yourself in a situation where you're starting to see performance issues, all you need to do is simply just set the emitter to none, and all of those particles will then be killed. They'll be just terminated or put to sleep. It's probably a more polite term of saying it, but yeah, you can obviously change all of that, change or define your settings in your particle system. Right, so what I've also done, so there again, just to continue, just to give you some more tips and pointers on it. Here's the emitter with a cube mesh, and it's set to flight direction. They have put the particles into a line, and now I've changed the color of my particles. This you can do, again, if we look at our device viewer, you can set this in your color. So this is towards the end of your particles. You can then say, all right, I want to change that color from orange to a blue, and you'll see my particles will now go through a blue color before they go back to yellow and into a white. You can obviously add and remove these as you need to. If I don't like my red, I can click on my red and delete my red and put my blue back down to the bottom. And then if you look there, my particles will be coming out blue. So that's just some flexibility we have for you. Again, the mass, so you can define your mass and your drag of your particles. And then if you go back to your forces, you can add a bit of gravity and some wind. So all of these different factors will change the way the particles behave inside of your 3D environment. So you can see there's my wind. If I increase my mass, the wind has less of an effect on my particles once they've been generated. So yeah, you can play around with it, and yeah, these are basically this is the overview of it. But you can say, okay, well, let me take some time, sit around and play, find out what works for you, find out some cool effects and stuff that you can do with it. So now seem to have a wind problem here, so let's just pull that out. Okay, so yeah, there's our colors, and yeah, you can sit and play and see what you can create with it. So then another nice thing that you can do with the particle system, let's just bring this in here, is if you're doing a show where your customer says, yeah, we kind of don't have any budget left to have a holding screen for the award ceremony or for the holding slide for the walk-in in the morning, it's very easy to go and create a little particle system. Use your creativity, put some colors in it, and you can chop and change things up, and then you could also do something like this. So once my particles have all reached their full state, essentially, you can then also do cool things like this. So what I did here, I just made a blue and a red, put some mass into them, added a bit of drag. I slowed the speed down and I upped the count. Then I also changed my scale of them. So I've got these long, thin strands. It kind of looks like a bit of a kind of a crazy bird's nest, I suppose. But you can very easily go and create, looks like this using the particle system. Yeah, are there any questions on the particle system this far?
Yeah, how do these weird faders work, which you can see in the back of the particle system with this shape? If you change back to the
Sorry, Thomas, you broke up there. The internet has fallen apart.
ah.
Oh, wait, now I can hear you. Sorry, yeah, please ask me that question again.
Yeah, if you go for the faders at the right,
yes.
How do these faders work? They look a bit different than the normal faders.
Yes, thank you. Good question. So these faders, they kind of essentially how this would work in relation to the time to live. So at the moment, my particles are living for 10 seconds. And if I take my, let me see, which one would be a good way to explain it? So if I take my speed and I want to bump my speed up to 10, I can then, you'll start seeing my particles moving a lot faster. Okay, there we go. So now I've got the speed into my particles. How this fader works is it is a relationship, or it kind of handles the behavior of your time to live. So if I take my speed now, and if I move my my speed at the bottom, so you'll see now what's happening. Wait, let me just put this in a nice way to explain it. So the bottom value, when I bring that, if I move that up, it's basically increasing the point in that time to live where those particles will start speeding up or start slowing down, or actually it is increasing the amount of time that they are slower before they then speed up. So if I move my higher value, which is my higher speed, if I bring that further down towards the bottom, you'll see all of my particles have now moved off quite quickly, because the point in that 10 seconds of time where they start moving faster is, if I look at it my rough estimate is about 3 seconds of, into its third second of life, it has now then reached that speed value where it needs to be at. Also, what you will notice, if I then expand or zoom out on my global camera, you will then see that my my particles have spread out a lot more because they're moving a lot quicker, a lot sooner.
Yeah, thank you.
If I hope that explains it. So essentially, those faders determine where in that particle's life those values are changed. So if I have it by default at the top and bottom, then those values are implemented at the start and the end of their life. And obviously it does that in a linear fashion. You can then change the linearity by moving those diamond or hexagonal shapes.
Yeah, and can I use more than 2 values in there?
I don't know. Oh yeah, you can. Hey, I've never actually done that before. Look at that. Yeah, Thomas, that's a good question. Yeah.
Good explanation, that one. There's another
No
question.
worries, yeah. Yeah.
Do the particles synchronize over several outputs, or maybe also over several devices or clients?
I have absolutely no idea. I would need to test that and let you know. I don't know if you have an answer on that one, Thomas.
Yes, they do.
They do. Oh, okay, good. Well, there you go. See, you learn something new every day. Okay, cool. Yeah, so, well, then that exactly goes back to, hey, they're live particles in a 3D environment, being tracked over the whole entire system. However many clients you then have in that system, those particles will then be tracked over that many outputs.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks. Head on.
Pleasure. Right. Okay, so we've finished talking about that. Now, if there's any more questions, obviously, please jump in. So what we can also do with the particle system is we can use it for tracking. So if I go to my little next queue, so we're going to wait for the other particles to die out in the background, and I have my mouse tracked with just a particle generating some circles, some soft dot circles, and my mouse is being used as my input. Again, you can use this with your tracking systems. You can connect it to an air scan. Thomas did a great job of programming the slot car races at ISE. That was using the tracking system and using the particles,
Thanks for
the
the
particle
flowers.
system. Sorry?
Thanks for the flowers.
Yeah. So you can very easily and quickly create quite nice and simple effects just by using a bit of tracking and a particle system. Right. Any more questions on particles before we jump into light layers? No. It's back. Good. Questions? No more questions? Okay. Right. So, light layers. Okay. Okay. So, Pandora's Box, obviously, again, it's a real-time 3D environment, and we can obviously have 3D objects inside of our 3D environment. To correctly kind of and to help you perceive the depth and gain perspective on your object, it's a good idea to have some lighting in them, or to light the objects. So this can be done in Pandora's Box quite easily. We also have a global light, which I'll show you in a little bit. Again, you can use it for creativity, and you can use it, also bringing sort of your virtual world into your real environment. Wow, my vocabulary. Sorry. Okay, so it's kind of it's really helpful in connecting your digital world into your real world. So when you have some objects or stuff moving around on stage, you can also replicate that in your 3D world. We'll get into that in a bit, but let's talk a little bit about this. So this is actually taken from our help file. If you haven't seen this, you should read our help file. So essentially what's happening in the real world, and what you're seeing here. So I'm on your camera, I'm talking to you. There's some light bouncing off my forehead, and you can see my face, and I can see my monitor, and I have a perception of depth because obviously I have two eyes. But what also really helps is having a bit of light shining off my desk from my desk lamp. And again, the same thing happens in a digital world. We have obviously an incident light. We have a surface, it's also known as a normal, and then we have the reflected light that is picked up by the camera. or the virtual camera. In the same way, it is also, in our real world, it's picked up by our eyes. And how the light is reflected obviously depends on the surface and what the material is, what the light is, etc., etc. And that kind of happens the same in Pandora's box. So the light is emitted by a light source. It has a start position, a direction, intensity, it has color, and that's kind of the default in Pandora's box. Again, you can also, or should I say or again, you can have these inherent light values added into an effect. So that's also, again, can be done in an easier manner inside of Pandora's box. So, okay, so yeah, I said light shines on objects and the light is reflected, which we then pick up and perceive. Object's property is also called its material, and they determine the interaction of the light. So for example, if you're looking at a shiny object, a metallic object, there will be a bit of color shift from what is reflected off of it, or the incident light, and what is reflected is there could be a color shift. Again, the amount of reflectivity depends on different objects, and the reflected light in the viewpoint cannot be edited. So it's again kind of in your real world, what the light that you're seeing is reflected. You can't control it. You can only control the source. You can't switch off the sun, but you can, for example, close the blinds, or if you've got a dimmer on your light switch, you can dim your lights. The same thing kind of applies in a Pandora's box, where you can reduce the intensity of the light, but once it's been reflected, you can't then change that light. It is once it's in the camera, that's it. There's no, you can't attenuate it, you can't control it beyond that. So let's dive in a bit. So again, if you want to create a light, let's go to my Pandora's box. Okay, so here back in my project, if I want to add a light, I'd obviously right click on my server. So go to add a device and then add a light. Then I've done that. In here you can see here's my light. It's called light 1. And you can also see here I have added the Pandora's box logo, and it's just at the moment it is just a mesh with its vertices, and there is no texture added to it, which is great. So now if I add a texture onto my model, if I move my global camera around, you can see my model is there, my texture is there, it's got the correct color, but something doesn't look right. It looks flat, and I can't, I've lost the perception of depth. So if you want to then bring it back, and we recommend if you're doing 3D model things, or 3D model projects, or projects with 3D content, is to then go and add a global light onto each model that you work with. So again, in your Eon FX engine, you can go under your lighting folder, and there is a tab there. Let's just pull this over to bring in a global light. Okay, you'll notice I just want to go back to that view, and if I fade in my global light, I've mixed it in, you can now see, come on mouse, there we go. I can now see my 3D object. I can then also change the amount of light that is being picked up from my global light, and I can kind of change how this 3D object is reflecting that light. And you'd obviously do that using the the different parameters. So you can set the softness, the ambient, the diffuse, or the specular light, and that will define how that object reflects the global light. And the next question, which you probably have, is what is the global light? So this is probably a bad example, but the global light is kind of actually, no, I won't use this example. I promised myself I wouldn't do it because it would just be terrible. Right, so the global light is essentially a light that is there in Pandora's box. It's always there, it's always on, and it can be found in the client display tab inside of the configuration tab in the render, or not in the render engine, but in the client display tab inside the config tab. And if you click on the default mesh shading, it will then determine how the mesh is shown if you add an object into your server or your 3D model. And down at the bottom is a global light point. This global light point is then predefined. Obviously, you can change that depending on the particular project that you're doing, but this is its default setting. And this light is then always shining inside of Pandora's box. It's only ever picked up or used if you add a 3D object into it. All right, sorry about that. So yeah, so now you can add some light into your project, and you can kind of now see. So as I move my object around, you'll see the shine that's coming off the edge of my model is then reflected into my camera. So if I move my project on, let's just reset my camera a bit, and let's bring in another plane just to help you understand this. So in the background, 1 second, there we go. So in the background, I have a plane. I just have a 16:9 plane. So it's a two-dimensional plane that I took from my stock assets. I stuck some lovely pink color on it. And now if I change the angle of my plane, you'll notice that the reflection from my global light, it changes, right? So my global light's obviously always there, always shining, always in that position. But as I change my my plane, the perspective or the amount of reflection and where it, or how I perceive it, or my virtual camera perceives it, is changed accordingly. Yeah, so you can also do the same thing, you know, if you have another light source set up, which I'll show you in a moment. You can obviously also set how that interacts with the cameras inside of Pandora's box. Questions on that so far?
Yeah, so the background layer now also uses an effect.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Good question. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. The only reason why my background layer is seeing that reflection is because I've added the global light effect onto that layer. So here is my global light. If I fade that out, then I'm just back to a pink background. If I fade that back in, there's the global light. Obviously, again, I can go and individually change the parameters of the effect on this plane, you know, just to represent different types of materials. So for example, if this was the real world, that could be maybe a shiny canvas, or it could be a matte pink painted set piece, for example. So you can go and replicate that inside of Pandora's box. So there, if I change my specular, it is changing the reflectivity that's been sent back from the global light, or more reflected off of that piece from the global light. Yeah, okay, so just to give you some more things to think about. Sorry, let's just reset all there. And so here's another thing just to give you some pointers. Just to help you get this concept of lighting and 3D models. So I have, in this one, I have a teapot and I have a sphere. And again, each of them, so if I click on my layer, so there's my layer 17 is my teapot. And again, I have my global light set up. Again, if I fade the global light out, the teapot looks like a teapot, but it doesn't look like a teapot. Now it's got some depth added into it. I can see the reflectivity of the teapot. And again, the same thing applies to my sphere. If I fade my sphere out, take the light out of my sphere, it just looks like a blue corner. So let's just play that part of my loop, and you'll now see there is my sphere moving backwards and forwards in my 3D environment, but yeah, it doesn't look so great until I fade in my global light. And now you can really see what you know, using the lighting effects in Pandora's Box does in terms of creating, you know, really sort of bringing your virtual worlds alive. Yeah. So, questions arising from that? If there are anything, am I going too fast? Do I need to slow down?
You have a good pace. Keep on.
Okay, keep on keeping on. Maybe we'll do this in under an hour. All right, so yeah, there's the end of those models moving around. So where you could implement this is what, okay, so let me backpedal a little bit here. Where you'd want to use this, or where you can use these types of things is, for example, if you're doing a car launch and you have a car that needs to move in onto a set, and you're projecting on the car, you're projecting on the floor, but you have an LED wall in the background. You can then go and create a light source, as I've done here, and you can then you can create a shadow, and you can then capture that shadow and use that shadow to, you know, mask the LED wall as the car moves past. You can also do the same thing and use this concept of capturing a shadow. If you have, for example, a speaker standing in front of a projected wall where you don't want to have a moving background behind him, so you could track your speaker and then assign you know, solid color as a background behind your speaker. So as he moves around, you then track your speaker, and then you track your what is I supposed to track again, Thomas? You basically, so, yeah, you track your light. Thank you.
But you
Yeah.
haven't shown us the light yet.
Yes, that's a good point. Thank you. So if I, oh man, I wish I had a brain. Okay, so right, if I switch my light frustum on, and I just need to toggle my preview off and toggle my preview back. Wait, come on, give me back my preview. So if I toggle my preview on again, my light frustum should be there. Okay, so there is my light frustum. What is my frustum? My frustum is basically frustum. It is showing me the wireframe of the beam that my light is casting. Again, if you look at my preview, I switch on my camera's frustum, and you can see my camera inside of my 3D space. So the wireframe is showing me what my camera is picking up, and the green wireframe is showing me what my light is shining onto into my 3D world. So my light is sitting in my layer, and Again, here for my light, obviously there are some settings that you can set up. For example, you can, let's just change this view a little bit so you can see as I change. Whoa. As I change things, sorry, my mouse is a little bit sensitive when I start pushing things around. You'll see now, so you can see there. Okay, let's switch my camera wireframe off. So here is my my light wireframe moving inside of my 3D world. So change the position of my light, and you'll see my shadow changes. Again, I can change the target, so where my light is shining exactly in reference to my 3D environment. Again, I can obviously change my different parameters. I can then also change the angle of my light, my aspect. I can change a Z roll. Basically, it's everything that you would do in a real world with a light, you can pretty much replicate inside of your 3D environment. Obviously you can set all your softness and all of that kind of stuff. You can also then set up, I haven't done it for this demo, but you can obviously set up a video file to be your light source. At the moment, I just have a 2x2 white pixel. You can use a video file and then project a video file onto your object. I wanted to do that for this, but I actually kind of forgot because I was concentrating on the other things. But you can still do that. You can go and apply you can do a texture projection, for example, and then project that video file onto a 3D model or onto a curve or onto a set piece. It's really easy to do, but I want you guys to go and figure it out for yourselves and look at it and just see, where you can bring that into a project, or where you can use that to be more creative in your next production or in your next show, and just playing with the product and finding things out. Okay, so here you can see in my output, I've got my shadow coming in. I can obviously then again track my light with reference to my speaker. So as he's moving around on the stage, that would be the background would be tracking him, and then the camera shot on the screen would look great because there's no moving image behind him, only just that matte color that you've put in using that effect. So you would set that up on another layer using again, there is a shadow catcher, and I can then just go and set a particular color for that background. I can also then go and make it black if I wanted to black that out. I mean, that's also possible. It obviously just depends on how you want to do that in your particular project. Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more how to create this shadow? Or how maybe you can just set up a new set of light and cast and receive layer?
Yeah, I think, yeah, so this one, well, I've got it, okay, so I've got this one done, which is using again, just so let me just reset all of these things. I want to reset the server here just so I can start it fresh on this one. Okay, so here is my background. Okay, so my background is the lady holding the orange in front of her eye. And here I've set this up as a cast and receive. And you can see as I change those values around, it then obviously will also interact with the light that it is receiving. And that light is obviously coming from the light that I've set up in my project here. Here is my light. I can also change my light around. I can change the aspect on my light. And I can also change my light's mode. So I can set it to be orthogonal, but as we know, the only real thing that I'd probably classify orthogonal would be laser, because that's kind of, that's been and the waveform has been altered, and it's pretty much straight on. So here we're obviously working in a perspective mode because real light has lenses and beam width and angles. So I have my background layer and I've set it up to catch the shadow. And yeah, it's casting and receiving with that light, and my light itself is sitting over here, and I'm sending out my light. If I change my output, there's my light, and here is my logo. So my logo as well is set to cast and receive. I can obviously determine how I want my light to be reflected off of my object, and then again, if I go back to my background, I can then go and manipulate the shadow that I'm picking up. So there it's receiving the light straight on. There is just determining how the light is reflected off that background. And then you can, obviously that will determine, you've got to play with the relationship to find the effect that you want, or the shadow that you're looking for. And then if I want to change the position of my shadow in relation to my background, I would then just go and then change the, so now I'm changing the physical position of my light. What I could also do is go to my logo, and then I can go and change the position of my logo to change the position, well, not change the position of my shadow, but obviously in relation to my light, the shadow that is cast from my 3D model will change with regards to where it is inside of my 3D world. So at the moment, there is my my 3D model. As I change my position, you can see my shadow changes with it. Another thing that I should show you, which is quite important, just in terms of working with shadows, is if I go to my next slide and I jump across, okay, is the shadow map size. So you've created your background, you've created your 3D model, you're casting your light onto your model, and then you're taking that light again and you're receiving it on your background. The shadow, or the resolution of your shadow, you can define, in the inspector. And obviously you can say, okay, this light, I want you to cast shadows, and you can change the map size. So if I go back to my Pandoras Box project, there we go, and I click on my light, let's just change this. Okay, so at the moment, you can see my shadows shadowing. If I change the shadow map size, so I take some of the resolution out of it, and I go to my camera 1 output, you can see there I start to get a more grainy shadow cast. And as I change the value down, so my shadow becomes a lot more grainier. Again, this functionality is in there just to, wherever possible, give you flexibility in preserving performance. Obviously, the higher the value you set, the more performance you're going to need to be casting shadows. So that is also built into the light itself, and how that shadow is processed. Questions?
Yeah, there's another question. Just saw it. No, it was another add-on to what you actually just answered already.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
Can you
Yeah.
try to push the light source at the very far on the top of it, so that we can see how the shadow behaves on the background if you move the light source more on top of the object?
So, okay, so now I'm going to move my light source up, and you will see my shadow is obviously now moving in relation to where my light source is. So maybe this will just help give an explanation of it. So here's my light. I move my light around and my shadow is cast onto my background. I can obviously change the angle of my light, and I can change the aspect a bit if I need to. Okay, so yeah, the near and the far plane doesn't affect it too much. But if I was to then, for example, bring my light, let's bring this closer in and let's bring this down. As I bring this in closer, obviously the perspective of where my light is to, okay, let's really bring this in quite close. And let's open up the angle again. So as I bring my light source closer, so the perspective of, that is the perspective of where the shadow falls onto the screen is determined by the position of my light. So if I change it to my output and I move my light around, so number one, you can see the light reflecting in my model. So you'll see pretty much where my mouse is pointing, it's straight on in front of my light. If I move my light across, you'll see that the position of my shadow changes in relation to that light. What I could also do, I think I should be able to do it in here. I'm just thinking, just in terms of the softness. Yeah, so yeah, okay, there is some amount of what do you call it, control that you have just in terms of working with that back shadow. I was just thinking more in terms of just creating a softer shadow, but I'd probably need to use another effect just to soften that shadow. But yeah, essentially, as I'm moving my light around, let's just go back to my all cameras view. So as I'm moving my light in my 3D space, so obviously my shadow changes. And if I go right up close, obviously then you will get a larger shadow.
Yeah, thank you. So far, no more questions. So if you have, that's the moment to put them in. Otherwise, yeah, I think that was a very good overview over light and shadow, and of course the particle system.
Good. Well, we can hang around for another minute or two if there are any more questions. If not, thank you for joining. If you have any more questions, yeah, please send us an email to support. So it's support.pandorasbox@christiedigital.com. And we'll be happy to answer your questions, provide you some more information. But as I recommend, when you have a moment, if you're a show tech, if you have a down moment, I think a lot of people now are sitting at home or working home offices, fire up your manager, start playing, start trying to see where you can bring it in on your next project, where you can use this, where this can be helpful for you, where you can find an opportunity to use your particle system and be creative with your particle system. Yeah, it's the more you play, the more you learn, and the easier things go for you. So yeah, thanks for joining, and looking forward to more questions.
Yeah, thank you. There's one more question. So how is the look? I think you spoke about it already a bit, like putting a media file into the light source.
Yes.
To have a look like a projector, or to project in the virtual world, to output a projection in the real world, maybe. But yeah, that's and just for the showcase, you can maybe put a white on the background?
Yeah, let's just see here now. Okay, so
Just that we have once.
yeah. Let me just take. I'm just trying to think of what's a good one. I just want to grab a sphere. I'm going to pop a sphere into. Again, I'll just drop it into that layer. There's my sphere, and I'm going to stick a. Let's stick with that color. Why not? Let's put that up on there. Okay. And no, wrong button. Ah, no. Sorry. Okay, so I'm back in there. Let's put our light source in, and I think I might need to use the texture projection again, but let's just see here if this does what I wanted to do. I'm going to put this one in, and I need to move my light source away. I also then need to tell this logo here to catch the light from one, and it's going to be cast and receive. So now let's now so there is my, okay, let's just do this. So here is my light. My light is now playing a black part of the video file. I know that because I know this video file. And it is set to loop. Let's just see if I drop the truck engine in here. So there is my light. It's projecting onto my sphere with a blue layer on it. There's the fan blades from the viscous fan on the engine running. And now I'm going to take my object. I'm going to scale my object down. Okay, and now you will be able to see my light source. So my light is now projecting this video file onto my sphere. Again, if you'll see, if I change the values of the diffuse light and the specular parameter, you'll see that I can see a bit of the texture that's lying beneath the cast light is showing there. So there again is my light, and it is now projecting this video onto my sphere. Again, I can now go and change some of the parameters. So I can change the aspect. Obviously, I want to keep my aspect a bit open. And sorry, 1 second. Now, if I go back to my output, so there's my sphere. It's catching the video file being projected from the light. And if I want to just take my plane and drop it in the background so we can see what's happening onto the background light. I'm going to drop my plane in the background, and I need to give it a texture so the light has somewhere to fall, which will be from a white particle. Okay. Now there is my white plane in the background. If I go to my all cameras view, you can see there it is. You can also see the shadow behind the ball where the projected light is not falling. And I already have this effect on my layer. I'm going to tell it to cast and receive, and I'm going to tell it that its source is light 1. Now, if I go and look at my composited view, or my view from well, my output, essentially what everything that's been through the composition pass and through my render pass, you can see the following things. You'll notice there is my sphere, and you can see the light is shining on my sphere. You can see the light bending around the side of my sphere. You can see the shadow that it is casting onto my plane in the background with my white texture on it. So if this is my projection screen, I can now then see how my sphere is going to catch the light and cause the shadow in the background. So I can obviously change the amount of ambient light. I can also change I can change my parameters in how my plane is receiving that light. So you see, as I increase or decrease the ambient light, it also changes the behavior of that material that is catching my light from my light source. So if I go back to my all cameras view and I move this around a bit, you can then see, oh, come on, mouse. You can then see what's happening in there. Now, if I go back here, just to recap, so I have my background, which you're seeing where the fan blade is hitting, or it's now the turbocharger. I have my plane, my white pixel, have light 1 set into it, and it's casting and receiving. I've mixed it in. I've told it which light source it is receiving. By the way, you can have, this is 1 light, there's a 2 light, and then there's a 3 light effect. And that obviously would just determine the number of lights that you can go and create. So you can add different lights inside of a project. So you can set up multiple light sources should you need to. So if I go to my, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so there's my global view. Again, also if I now take my sphere and I change the position of my sphere, as my position changes, you'll see how it, number 1, catches the light or the video from the light that's been projected onto it. Number 2, how it casts the shadow onto the background. So as I move my sphere towards my light source, obviously there I'm fallen out of its beam. But as I move it back, you can see then how the shadow changes in relation to where my sphere is in relation to the light. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I think
Cool.
that's it about questions for now. Thank you all for listening. And thank you,
Cool.
Dave.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Stop showing screen.